Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Solution Junkies Live. Thanks for joining us this week. So last week, we heard some inspiring stories of transformation and very much a call to action to start looking at planning your transformation journey now. Mark and Rebecca both gave us some really good insights into initial things that they looked at and topics that they uncovered as they started to plan their roadmaps. And today we want to take that topic a step further. So we want to dig into some of the details around how do you actually prepare for your digital transformation journey, and what are the things that you need to consider, and some of the things you need to start thinking about. Now, we are lucky that we are joined by two guests who help organizations do exactly that. They help organizations look at everything from prepping your requirements through to vendor selection and far, far beyond that. So we will let them introduce themselves, but just a warning, guys, the fun fact for today, we'll let you talk about your role a bit, but also we want to know from you what is one of the most exciting things you've done in lockdown. So I'm going to start with you, Ivan, because I know you've done something really exciting. You want to tell us about your role and what that is?
Thanks, Vera. Hello there. So I'm an independent CRM consultant. The word independent is very important to me. It means I have no affiliations with any suppliers, organizations, software companies, and so on. I talk to them, obviously, but I don't no commercial agreements. And I help charities, non-profits, memberships, higher education organizations do system reviews, procurement analysis, and project management of implementations. You want to do my one exciting thing I've done during lockdown? Yeah. So I think, well, hopefully the most exciting thing I've done during lockdown is I have written my second novel, which is being published in May. Thank you, in May this year. So that's my that's my thrill.
That is pretty exciting. That's going to be hard to live up to, Steve. Oh no, we can't hear you.
Is Steve on mute?
Are you on mute, Steve? Oh no, he's telling us something really exciting.
It's not going to work.
He doesn't know we can't hear him.
Steve, you're on mute.
Oh, we're going to have to come back to Steve. Technical difficulties. The mute button. I think that's probably the number one thing I learned in lockdown. I'm one of the people who's constantly on mute talking to myself. Literally on the call just before this, people were like, Vera, no one can hear you. I've been talking for about 3 minutes. So let's get Steve back on. Let's see if we can hear him.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I don't know. I didn't press a thing, honestly. No, this is Gremlin.
Sorry, Steve.
If there's anything I've done in lockdown, it was I felt privileged to get away from the same four walls when one of the clients that I work with are a sort of emergency type service, so they're out there doing it, and the chief exec, who he was on here last week, Mark Curtin, encourages everybody to get out there and volunteer. So driving vans, filling stock, getting things out about because they move food. Was a pretty good thing to do, I think. I have to say, in the freezing cold of a December Friday. But, beyond that, the usual boring story.
Far more honourable.
I've got to ask you, Steve, did you actually drive the van?
Oh yeah, I drove the van. Yeah, I'm a regular volunteer as well as a sort of paid helper or paid person. But yeah, it was great.
I want to drive the van, but I don't think people should allow me to. But that's a different story. All right, so let's dig right into it, guys. So I think today we're going to talk a lot about kind of what people need to define up front, but wanted to start initially with thinking about defining success. And I think a lot of the conversations that we have start with a compelling event. So an organization has something that they have to do. So, I've got to get off of this system by X date because it's being decommissioned, or, we have a new channel that we're servicing. So I've got to figure out, how to implement that in given X period of time. But I think the challenge between kind of getting from this compelling event to actually defining what success looks like and how big a change this will be for the organization, and the types of different behaviors you want to drive forward, and what you actually want to get out of it, is quite a journey for some folks. So what would you guys advise in terms of what to define up front, and how do you think about really framing those conversations internally around project success and around the kind of change that the organization will feel?
Do you want me to kick off?
Yeah.
This it may be obvious. I think a really useful way to do this is to create a perhaps a more formal business case, literally a business case document. Because if you do that, you're going to be looking at those sort of things. You're looking at defining your business problems, your key issues, your risks, potential benefits at the top level. And I think doing all those things starts to therefore, build out how you would see success. And I think in particular, one I really think works well is in a business case is aligning with the organization's strategic objectives. So if we take a charity, for example, it could well be that it's reaching more beneficiaries. Well, if that's the case, then if that's one of the success criteria, then okay, there's always a challenge we can perhaps come back to as to how much a system does or doesn't, impact that particular thing. But I think by doing that, then it means that you're starting to tease out, to start with, hopefully in a structured way, what it is you're looking for, and then that will come out from there.
Do you agree, Steve? Would you add?
Of course, who wouldn't agree that particularly the discipline of writing things down is not always well executed in non-profit organisations. There's a sort of feeling that this is the right thing to do. I liked your question, Vera, because there's a sense in there something triggers the moment when we need a new X. Oh, I need a new CRM. The one I've got's rubbish. I hear that so often, and that's a really bad reason, of course. And so many times, the one they've got isn't rubbish. It might be a bit out of date. It might be that people don't know how to use it. I know I'm not sowing the seeds of everyone's got to have a new CRM very well here, but quite often it's just got out of date. It's not been updated. It's not been well used, and it isn't doing a good job. But not because it's rubbish. It's because maybe what you want it to do has changed, and you haven't realized that it wasn't built to do what you now want it to do. So I think and I've related to that, getting in your collective corporate head what you really want is crucial. I mean, is this a digital transformation, or is this just a new technical system to do a particular function? And the difference between those are massive. And I'm afraid with the proliferation of people like me saying, oh, digital transformation is just the thing, it's the future, you must X, you must Y, you really ought to do this, look at so-and-so, aren't they good? There can be this sense of conflating what could be a relatively straightforward requirement, a replacement, a modernization, an upgrade, with a fundamental, big, total organizational change. And they're really not the same thing. And the way you then address them and go about addressing the risks and the outcomes and the dimensions of the project are really different. So get in your head what this really is about, and I agree with Ivan. And then if by writing it down, it's like writing an essay. It just forces you through the rigor of having to sort of justify your arguments.
And equally, Steve, I think something you all should have said, or I should have said earlier, is you're quite right. It isn't about my system's rubbish. But the other things, of course, is when you start looking at it, you realize it's not your system, it's your data. You're not collecting the right data. You're not getting good data quality. You aren't training people. Well, if you aren't training people, it doesn't matter how good the system is. The processes aren't correct, etc., etc. So, yeah, could not agree more. That's totally
good. All right. So when we look at, let's just assume we've defined our success and we've got, a charter or a business case that outlines that. I think typically the next step is to kind of jump right into requirements. And I think a lot of organizations struggle with, I need to write everything down, right? How do I communicate, to different vendors, what my requirements are? How can I ensure, my scope is going to be absolutely accurate? And there's kind of this balance that needs to be struck between, yes, articulating the needs of the organization and being very clear with what you're expecting to be kind of fulfilled both conceptually and functionally, but it's balancing that with timelines and pragmatism, and you can't necessarily spend the next year doing that. So what would you guys, how do organizations strike that balance, and what would you guys recommend in terms of anything that you've seen that's been really beneficial?
It links back to what we were just talking about. If we know what we want, then it's going to be easier to articulate what we want, and then to sort of go out and find it. And I think that with lots of non-profits that I work with, the last time that they went out and made a big decision like this and made such an investment, even if they already get that it's not just about the tech, it's about all those things I've mentioned, the data and the people and the skills, it still can feel like we're going to do this the way we did it. I'm used to having done this the way it was done last time, and that was probably 10 years ago. And quite a lot has changed, not just technologically in 10 years, but also about what it is that we're buying. We're not buying a bit of kit, and again, I would be the first to engage with a procurement department who are professionals in the game of identifying requirements and buying what it is we need, and not wasting time and effort on what we don't need. But if you're buying a bridge, or if you're specifying a mechanical device, which is what a technology system kind of used to be, a tick list of features is not an unreasonable way to do it. But unfortunately, that's not, in my opinion, in my experience these days, that's not the best way to invest in technology anymore. 100%. And what you're after now is a partnership based on technology that is proven. So you don't have to go through the checklist. You don't have to sort of specify the nuts and bolts. What you need to do is ensure that you've got an architect and you've got a builder, and that you've got a partner who is going to help you do something that you haven't probably got the skills to do, which is why you're hiring them, because you did it 10 years ago and technology was different in those days. So I have often found that getting people away from this concept that we're just buying a widget, or we're just, we're not going to a superstore and buying a computer. We're actually buying into a whole new way of working. Even with, back to my last point, a relatively simple system, I think it's about mindset. So the first thing to do in doing that is not to run out and do, an as-is business process analysis of what we've got now and spend £50,000, which I've seen done, working out this is what we've got. You were mentioning it earlier, is that wise? No, what we need to understand is what kind of help we need, and focusing on that as the specification rather than the widgets and the nuts and the bolts. At least that's my opinion.
I agree. It's interesting too, because I think it's both on the customer side, and I also think it's on the partner side, because you still see a lot of kind of antiquated versions of scoping, right? Minimum amounts of custom objects. Like we were talking to a customer and they said, "Oh, are you gonna put something in that says we can only have a maximum of 2 custom objects?" No. And I said, for us to create a custom object could take like 5 minutes. Like, that's not the point. We need to understand the process, and we need to understand the value, and you can't really be looking at it from a field level, object level perspective, because the scope that gets delivered is skewed by so much more than that. But I do think it's the industry as a whole, you're right, Steve, needs to kind of move forward a little bit. Anything that you would add, Ivan, in terms of kind of advice around prepping requirements?
So I agree with everything that Steve says, except for one thing. So let me play devil's advocate.
There's always something we can disagree on.
I hope so. It'd be boring otherwise. Otherwise, we just have one of us here. I'll play. Maybe it's a little bit of devil's advocate. I actually wonder if there is some benefit in doing a degree, Steve, of the as-is process review. Now, why I say that is because if we are taking a step back for a second and trying to be a tiny bit more pragmatic and working with a vendor, I'd be able to go to a vendor and go, we want a partner. Yes, that's one thing, but they're eventually going to say, well, what is it you're after, and what is your budget, and how do you want to do it, etc. And I think I could not completely 100% agree that the days of 150 tick boxes are gone. I really hope they're gone. And it's worth actually saying, one of the reasons, to be fair, is that the new platforms can almost do anything, which is amazing. It isn't, can you record a supported information, do your direct debits or anything else? You can. You will be able to. So the question is how. But I do think that at the same time, doing a degree of, and it shouldn't be a £50,000 one, but doing a degree of reviewing of your processes does help tease out where some of your business issues are, some of the key concerns, some of those issues. And actually, I've sat in rooms before where we have people from different departments, and we say, well, this is what we do at the moment. And someone says, why'd you do that? You say, well, in August 3 years ago, you told me you needed this. So we've now built a whole new process around it. So, we don't do. So there are, even come back to what we were saying earlier, there are some quick wins one can do by saying, well, let's just stop that. So again, therefore, you move on to the more interesting and useful part of the new solution requiring things. So I do think there can be, and it may come down to, the right organization or how you do it. I do think that as is, it can be a little helpful. I don't think there's any point in people trying to do to-bes, and I think now I hear this a lot. I want to create my to-be process before I start. Well, no, you don't, because some of that is going to depend on the solution, some of that is going to depend on your benefits, some of it's going to depend on the partner, etc., etc. And there could be more than one way of skinning the cat, so don't do that. I think that's a very good point. And I hope, and what do you think, Vera? I mean, let's actually put it back at you. And if I came to you as a client with processes, does that help? Or actually, is Steve right, and it doesn't because you don't want to look at that?
I think it's a combination, right? I think it's a balance. I think it's a balance of how much, to your point, you try to do on your own, because you can actually spend loads of time trying to document the as-is, trying to document the to-be, getting ready for us to come in, only to then, to your point, figure out that actually a lot of that will change by the nature of going through the design process, and, the things that you were probably really worried about or, thought that were really complex are actually the things that are fairly straightforward. And, it's the things that you didn't think you needed to dive that deep into that we end up spending more time on. So, you're right in that we need to know, what you're after. We need to understand kind of what the goals are, what the baseline is. But in terms of reams of documentation around, what you do today and how, that translates to what you want to do in the future, I would balance that. I wouldn't do too much without, a partner involved, because, you might end up costing yourself a ton of rework. And at the end of the day, even if it's internal resources, that still costs. It's still time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Interestingly, you both picked up on a very important word in your answers around partnership, because I do think this is the key to success, right? Is partnering with the right organizations to fulfill the outcomes that you want. And I think when you look at this process of vendor selection, I think it's quite difficult, for organizations to know what they should be evaluating. I think there's a big question around, what comes first? Do I pick my technology? Do I pick my platform? Do I pick my partner? I think there's pros and cons to both. But what would you say in terms of even just that question around platform versus partner? What do you think people should be focusing on initially?
I've got one quick thing to say on that, and I hope this isn't going to be controversial, but I think that more and more I'm doing this, the more an organization might already have, and in particular, Dynamics or Salesforce. If they have, and if they're happy with it, and you have good internal support, and you've got a new application, I think there has to be quite a good reason not to have that as your default platform. So in that instance, I would encourage a charity or any organization to do that. Certainly of a small to mid-size. I guess if you become a really large organization, then maybe some, you get, because clearly there are differences between Salesforce and Dynamics and the rest. Of course there are. One will say they're better than the other. But fundamentally, if we're looking at, the benefits you're getting, and if you look specifics, whether it's, managing supporters, director, they can do it, as we keep saying. So therefore it comes back to the partner, which we'll talk about again. That's my opening gambit. There's a lot more to say. Steve?
Of course. I think there is a big part of the conversation is it's helpful to eliminate, as you suggest, Ivan, the confusion that can easily leap out, and the waste of time looking at comparing those platforms. And they both do. They're so carbon copies of each other these days that there are very few technical reasons for picking one or another. But before perhaps the obvious implication is, therefore, what is it about the partner that matters? We can talk about that. I'd just like to touch on the fact that it's not always about Salesforce versus Dynamics. There are other alternative technologies, and I don't mean CRM style platforms, customer solution platforms. There are sometimes, increasingly, I think there are more edge solutions which could be relevant to some particular requirements. And as I said at the beginning, when I was talking about the difference between transformational programs and but more specific tech-driven solutions, they can often be driven by a really good bespoke tool that might be neither of the big platforms. They probably need to join up with those platforms or have the potential to do so in the future. But I think there are, if we just turn away for a second from the big partner required more substantial investments to the tens of thousands of smaller non-profits that start up with a new system, they don't really need. They need a system that doesn't need a partner, really, because they haven't got the budget for anything like that. They might have a few tens of thousands if they're lucky, and they've got to spend that on getting their data in the right place and training their people and paying a couple of years worth of licensing. So actually, there's not a lot of value to be added from any partner. So in those circumstances, they've got to find a solution that they can do for themselves, and I think I only say that because I think it's easy to fall into the conversation that there's only two games in town. I think there's more.
No, I think that's a good point, and I think it's always a question, again, kind of going back to requirements of how long you belabor these decisions. Like, how long do you analyze it over 2 years and try to pick every single feature and function?
And by that time the world's changed. So actually, even the premise of the original question has changed. So start again, have another debate for another 2 years. And I know some clients that continually debate for years and years and then never make any decisions.
No, and it brings up a good point. So Dan from the audience has just asked, typically, how much emphasis should we be placing on communicating or demonstrating, to organizations, specifically not-for-profits, that the technology is only one part of the digital transformation program, that there is so much more beyond that, and how big do you guys think that learning curve is generally?
Well, I'll pick up where I mentioned before about the difference between is this a transformation or is this just a tech lift and shift? Are we just buying something off the shelf, or are we getting into a change program and a relationship and business process changes that we don't even know what they are yet? If it's the latter, then it really does take a lot of getting that across, because I'm scared if I'm already busy hitting my targets and achieving what I'm doing. I want a tool preferably that just is easy to adopt and doesn't change my life much. I'm not necessarily thinking about the things I don't know, because they're not in my scope of understanding. My experience tells me that the sooner you can lay it on the table and say, look, if we're going to do this in the way we've all been talking about and getting excited about and watching vendors' videos and all that stuff that you can do, it's going to take you, a rule of thumb that I tend to use is you need to commit about 3 times as many days to this project as you're going to buy from this partner. Yeah. So if you're going to buy 100 days, then that's 300 days. Where are you going to get 300 days from? What people are going to stop doing their day job to get involved in this project? Whether it be the original sort of specification or the working on the change program or the changing of roles. It's just huge. And it's only when you start sort of plotting what 3 times the partner volume is into a calendar and stick it up there and say, so actually you need people from your team to work on this project for X days next August and September. Are you okay with that? And suddenly people are not okay with that. Or they're thinking, actually, I've got a campaign on then. That's my year end. What about this? I was going to implement a new website then. And then the reality of the scale of a program starts to sink in. It's not just about paying for software and vendors to come and do it to us. We have to contribute.
Yeah, I completely agree. To be honest, that was one of the bigger lessons I think we learned very early on. We actually created this concept of a readiness assessment because we had a ton of customers at certain points in time get really excited, pick their vendor, and they're like, okay, we're going with Salesforce, now let's start. And then you get to workshops and realize actually you haven't lined up, the appropriate people, to your point, Steve. You haven't thought about, the data. You haven't actually prepped for any of this. And now we're asking you to make decisions, and you kind of get halfway through a couple of workshops and realize these people aren't empowered to make decisions. You know, they haven't actually been educated properly around what this change means. And so even just putting it, again, down on paper to say, have you done these things? Do you have the proper support internally? Have you decided how much change you're going to allow this program to impact, and how much disruption and things like that? It's so critical, because you end up starting a project and then stopping halfway through if you're not kind of measuring readiness, I think.
This in itself, though, if we take it back to your top question here, is about vendor selection. Then how do you manage? And I almost combine Dan's question with your earlier one, Vera. So how can a non-profit or any organisation find that vendor that understands what you're saying or can do what you're saying? And the answer is, if you combine Dan's question about how much you should spend on demonstrating and communicating versus everything else, you can't get away from the fact that you're going to be looking at software. You know, it is a part of it. It gets people excited. So there's a good thing with that. But when you're doing a vendor selection, so much, and this is the challenge of our roles to pass back to the charities, is to help them to understand that part of that, a lot of the selection is not about the software. It's about the vendors' understanding of your organization, of project management, of everything you've just said, of interpretation. And the first vendor that comes in and goes, we can do this in 6 weeks, we've done it before with 100 other places, it cost you £5.50. You know, and well, wow, that's great. You know, talk to someone else. So it is about getting that organization. How that can be done, probably, I'm not sure we have time today. There's lots more I could talk about, you know, the mock workshops I've done before and so on and so forth, which I love. But, you know, it is a challenge, but it's about making them understand that's part of the procurement process as well as before you even get into that.
And I think that's a good point. And I would like you to touch on the workshop element a little bit, Ivan, because I do think that a lot of organizations make the mistake of putting out these RFPs, and it's a completely paper-based process, you know, and there's no way to really evaluate a cultural fit. And you've gone and made a decision without meeting anybody, you know, from these vendors, which seems, you know, counterintuitive.
So I have a great belief, and this tends to work best when you've sort of, imagine we have done our early analysis of the vendors, we get down to the last 2, maybe 3. So we're saying, right, are we looking at this, or this? And therefore, how do we know if we're going to work well with the vendor? Now, also, hopefully, if you get down to the last 2, I can say to yourselves and others, I want to meet the real people that could be working on my team, not the salesperson, but a project manager, a functional consultant, whatever else. And we'll create these mock workshops, or a sprint in a day. And we'll say, let's take an example in our sector, event management. So, you know, and that's great because it crosses multiple teams. It's not something that's necessarily completely out of the box. And I'd ask the vendors to come in and we'd run a workshop. How would you run a workshop? So I'll bring my events team in, we're all sit like this and go, right, you know, impress us. What are you going to do? And it's amazing because when you actually get someone standing up, you know, do they have an understanding of your organization? Do they empathize? Do they know how, if the first person says, what do you want from your database? Out, you know, that's not what I want to hear. I want to hear you understand about the challenges, everything that Steve was talking about, what you're saying about, and then bringing that full circle. So, I'm a massive fan. But hey, surprise again, following on from Steve's, that takes time. You know, but you're going to spend, certainly for a mid to large charity, you're spending tens, hundreds of thousands of pounds, maybe more. So hey, come on, you know, spend a little bit of time on your procurement and your readiness, getting it ready. That's a massive thing.
And I do think we could, between the 3 of us, probably give people loads of tips and tricks and lessons to what to do and what not to do. But in the interest of time, I will ask you both if you can just give one last piece of advice to any organizations that are embarking on this journey and starting to prep this kind of pre-project process. You know, what's one thing that you think that they should either be considering or, you know, avoid as they start to plan that out?
Steve looks like he's thinking, so I'll jump in. I'm going to be a little bit boring, I'm afraid, because I'm going to repeat something we said earlier, but I do think it's the most important. I was asked recently, when I was pitching for a project, what's your number 1 risk in terms of a CRM implementation? And I thought about it, and I came to the conclusion that it is the under-resourcing or inappropriate resourcing of especially your internal team. And I just think that's the most important. I really, really do. And it's hard because you may not know what you need. So therefore, it may be either talking to vendors, talking to consultants, talking to other charities. Have you done it before? What did you do? How did you do it? I just think if you don't allocate that time, if you don't think about the people you need, whether you're going to have to backfill, whether you're going to do it, so it's people. It is people. So I'm sorry that's a bit boring because we're kind of repeating ourselves, but I just think that's the most important message from me.
In my case, I need to. Am I muted? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Great. My mute's flashing at me here. That was quite hard. I was looking to the sky there, Ivan, and I reflected on a couple of more successful projects recently, and I think it goes back to a lot of what we said about starting well. To get everybody behind this, to get everybody understanding all of these subtleties and nuances or new ways of working, it's really good to have some kind of clarity of what this is really all for. And it's a bit trite to say, well, think about your customers, put your customers first, be customer centric. But I am going to say that. But it's good to try and express this in a way that says, if we do this project, if it hits your team, your department, or this whole organization, or when it comes to you, what is it about this that's going to help us do what we do better? Yeah. And as a non-profit, is it going to save us money, which is valid because we can deploy it, or time to other things? If we can save half of the time that our fundraisers waste moving data around or loading stuff up, or just can't do or never have had, a forecast sheet of a pipeline for their donors that's coming up, then that's a really, as long as we can translate that and identify the benefits in terms of the difference it's going to make to our mission, which ends up coming back to our constituents, I think our beneficiaries, then that I've found that's a good way of kind of holding it together. People get motivated about what we're here for. Most people do. And therefore, it's not just another tech project. It's not something that's going to just like we're going to have to learn something new. It actually becomes something which could help them do something better for somebody else. And I think I know it's a bit far-fetched and it's a bit sort of flighty, but I think it holds things together. And you can do that with writing a little charter. We will make decisions that either do this or don't do that or will achieve this that helps us achieve our mission. And then we can all make the same decisions on the same basis.
How exciting, Steve.
I love that. I love it. Well, no, thank you. I think that's really good advice to leave people with, and just want to do a massive thanks to both of you for joining. I think a lot of insights today, and I do think this is a topic that a lot of people are grappling with now that we are starting to come out of lockdown and they're thinking about what their next project's going to be, and this process can be quite daunting. So thank you very much for sharing your insights, and yes, we'll have you back on the show anytime.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for asking.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining this week. I think two good kind of takeaways to leave you with. You need to make sure that you're lining up your resources internally to create the impact that you want to achieve. And you need to focus on the why, and you need to make sure that why, again, has an impact beyond the four walls of your organization. So good food for thought. We will, as always, post more resources on the Solution Junkies Live channel for you to think about in terms of planning your next implementation, and continue to take questions beyond this live broadcast. So if you've got things that you'd like to ask Ivan and Steve, definitely plug those into the thread as well. All right, thanks everybody, and see you next week.